Hey everybody, welcome to our virtual Bible study for the North Hamilton Church of Christ. And if you are keeping up with what we're doing right now, you know that we are in the middle of a great study on the existence of God. In fact, we just started that study here not long ago, so if you're just now getting in, you haven't missed too much. I do want to encourage you, all these videos are being archived. You can go back and you can pull them from our archive on YouTube, and you can start from the very beginning and you can get caught up pretty quickly on where we are in our study on the existence of God. Tonight we're just in lesson number 3, but the introduction lasted a couple of weeks, so we're really sort of like 4 or 5 lessons into our study on the existence of God. Hey, before we get started tonight, I want to ask you to do a couple of things for me. Number one, if you are on YouTube tonight, please give us a thumbs up and then hit the subscribe button right below the video. Now, I've explained before and I'll do it again tonight. This is really beneficial for both of us, right? For you, you never miss content. If you subscribe to our videos, anytime we post something new to YouTube, you're going to get a notification. In fact, if you're on YouTube when we go live, you'll get a little, I think it's a little pop-up screen. So you're going to get the benefit of never missing content. You're going to find our content easier. And for us, we get the benefit of boosted views, which helps push us up the queue a little bit on YouTube. If you're on Facebook, we need you to give us a thumbs up and then please take the time to share the video on your timeline. So go to your timeline, hit the share button and go to your timeline, put share, make it public, make it shareable so that it can get out there. And from what I understand, this is a pretty exciting topic for a lot of people because a lot of people are viewing these videos on the existence of God, and we want that, right? I'm not the smartest guy in the world, but I know that God exists, and we want you to know that God exists, and we're going to make our case for the existence of God. So we're kind of doing some preliminary work right now, just kind of taking our time before we get into some of the arguments to assess atheism and whether atheism itself is rational. And I would encourage you that this is really sort of part 2 of the first part of our study. So I would encourage you to go back and look at lesson number 2 to kind of get you halfway up to where we are right now. So what about atheism? Okay, so tonight we have a lesson entitled The God Delusion Fad. And that seems weird because The God Delusion is the title of a book. I don't know if you can see it, but it's a book written by Richard Dawkins. I don't know Richard Dawkins, but I've read his writings. In fact, I've read The God Delusion a couple of times, I think 2 to 3 times. I've read the book twice at least for sure. I know I've read it and then back through a number of times. And we're going to talk about that because I think he's kind of, among a few, the voice of atheism today. He's sort of a popular atheist today in our modern culture. And we're going to talk about him and some others who've made some arguments, and we're going to examine those arguments as part of this sort of lesson 2, lesson 3 on why people choose atheism over theism. And so I have a few quotes from him from his book. I'm not encouraging you to go by it, and I don't like the premise of the book or the way he in general talks about religion. Not to say that every single thing he says is without some foundation. He does make some points not to prove or deny the existence of God, but in some of his criticisms of false religion, I would agree with that, but we'll talk about that as we go through. We have already demonstrated in the last lesson, and I would encourage you to go back and look at lesson number 2, that atheism is not rational. It's not rational, and enhanced evidence of that is going to be presented, I think, tonight, of the irrationality of atheism, right? When we're going through this particular study, that an atheist would spend a single second arguing against God, to me, is just unimaginable. I don't know why anybody would waste breath doing that if God does not exist. Now, I'm always for healthy debate. I think healthy debate is a really good thing, and I think it's productive for society. People need to be able to talk to each other. This cancel culture thing is disallowing conversation, and that's terrible for society. We don't need to be caught in that dilemma, right? But last week we introduced this idea, this empty room dilemma, and we had a chart in class where we were discussing, and instead of a room, we just did a circle, but it's the empty room dilemma. And we said that a person, and I'm including myself, right? I'm a person, we cannot conceive and define or even describe what does not exist in an empty room because the room is empty. So for atheists to continue to pour voluminous, voluminous amounts of time into materials and videos and lectures and debates and brochures and printed pages and computer screens and URLs and all those things to try to prove to people that an omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent God does not exist is, to me, nonsensical, right? So you have to build it up and define what's in the empty room and then suggest to people that's not actually in the room. See how that works? To me, that just doesn't make a lot of sense. The other part of the problem for us tonight is going to come, for an atheist that is, in the form of proof based on non-empirical forms, right? So we're going to, at least in some way tonight, get into the idea of the limitations of the scientific method. I'm all for science, and science is wonderful and beautiful and exciting. It's just so exciting to learn things scientifically, but there's limitations placed upon it. It can't answer everything, and it can't answer what it suggests it can answer about the beginning of the universe and the existence of God. It has no capacity to do that. So we're going to come back to that empty room idea in just a little bit. So we're going to talk about some of these remaining areas where people say, I'm an atheist because of this. And one of those sections has to do with science itself. And we're going to incorporate Dawkins. We've got his book, and we're going to look at Dawkins a little bit, and Christopher Hitchens. We might make reference to him. You've got Stephen Hawking, and you've got a few of those guys. Now, of course, he's not with us anymore, but you've got those guys I would consider to be leading atheists today, sort of modern atheists, sort of the modern atheism movement, and we'll be listening to some of their voices today. Now, in addition to the reason that we presented last week, what we called the rational reason, that they just think it's more rational to deny the existence of God, atheism also has real trouble with the scientific method, right? And I don't mean that they reject the scientific method. I mean they lean wholly on the scientific method, and there's a stumbling block built into the just complete adoption of the scientific method as the answer for everything in our universe. Because they advocate for a naturalistic and therefore atheistic origin to the universe. So belief in a pre-existent supernatural being, according to atheism, does not meet the criteria of rational belief because God cannot be scientifically verified. You may have heard people say something like that before. And science is therefore assigned an apparent ability to explain all of the data in the world, in the human experience, without God, right? So they say if you can explain it without God, therefore science is the answer to everything. Now here's what that looks like practically, and I'm going to give an illustration. I heard this from a college student who had someone arguing against the existence of God. A college professor in this girl's classroom stood in front of an entire class of people and took out a pocket full of change. And by that I mean like quarters and dimes and nickels and pennies and things of that sort. And he took one coin and he dropped it. And he said, what had just happened? The coin dropped on the ground. Did the same thing for another coin, did it continuously. And he went all the way up to about 9 coins. Then he took a 10th coin and he said, what's going to happen on the 10th coin? And of course, as even I would do, the class said, that coin is going to fall to the ground. It's going to fall to the ground. And he goes, is there anybody who's a Christian in this room? And he had people raise their hands, and they did. He goes, now I want you to pray that God would not allow this coin to hit the ground. And, they were kind of put on the spot. And he said, now pray for it, pray really hard. And he asked them if they did, and they said that they did. And he held up that 10th coin and he loosed it from his fingers. And what do you think happened? It fell to the ground, right? It fell to the ground. And what he was doing is trying to make an appeal to the scientific method as the actual explanation for everything. Because he will then respond, and did respond in this girl's class. He said, I thought God controlled everything. But then he goes on to explain the laws of physics and gravity and things of that sort as saying science explains everything. God has no place in this universe. God is not real. That's his ultimate point by that example. They do the same thing when they talk about lightning, right? They might say, you think lightning is this display of the power of God, when in truth it's just electricity. Even Ben Franklin figured that out when he experimented and figured out that it was just electricity. So the belief is that knowledge is genuinely opposed to God, that true knowledge opposes God, therefore God does not exist. And that the more we learn in science, the less room there is for God to exist. That's the dilemma that they've created and placed upon Christianity and religion. They think it's a dilemma. Now here's the interesting thing. When we read the writings of atheists, even Richard Dawkins and some others like that, I mean popular atheists, Christopher Hitchens and Stephen Hawking and those guys, when we listen to them talk, they actually admit there are limits to what science can tell us. And that's the truth. I agree with them on that. There are limits to what science can actually explain to us. Now, there was a time when Stephen Hawking, and you can learn about Stephen Hawking, the fact that they just recently made, within the last several years, a movie about Stephen Hawking. He's considered or was, when he was alive, he was considered just sort of a leading mind. Even though his body was incapacitated, his mind still functioned. He'd still could communicate via computer, and so people considered him to be a brilliant lecturer and a brilliant mind. And so Stephen Hawking seemed to approach the question of origins with an admission that science could only explain so much, that perhaps another field of study would necessarily discover the actual meaning behind the universe. And he did that in A Brief History of Time. If you've got his book, A Brief History of Time, I encourage you to go to about page 187. I guess that would depend on printing as to the page number, but go to about page 187 and read page 188, 189, 190, 191. Read that section, and within those pages, he actually admits the possibility of a way to explain the universe without science. Now, that's a pretty damning admission to atheism, to suggest that science is the way to explain the universe, and then to say, well, maybe science can't really do everything. And in that conclusion, right, of his book, he speaks of the possibility of God and the bearing of God to the question of existence. Now, when he uses God there, I think he's probably speaking more metaphorically than he is an actual omnipotent, omnibenevolent, eternal, omnipresent, omniscient creator God. I'm not sure he's admitting to that, but he is at least admitting that there could be something beyond that is the explanation for the universe. And then, of course, he would conclude in the end that God is unnecessary to origin, even though he admitted the possibility that God existed. There are others who do exactly the same thing, right? There was a work by Stephen Jay Gould called The Rock of Ages, and he admitted the same thing. When he was discussing the realm of authority, when he was in his work on the Magisteria, when he was talking about it, he speaks of non-overlapping magisteria, to which he coined the acronym NOMA. And there's actually a big discussion on NOMA, NOMA, in Richard Dawkins' book on this idea. When he essentially admitted there could be more to explain the universe than just science. And a number of others have done the same thing. Now, Dawkins does that, and I would encourage you, if you have Dawkins' book, and it's popular, a lot of people have Dawkins' book, start around page 54, 55, and read a few pages into that, and what you'll find is he actually spends several pages of the book opposing why questions, right? He's almost agitated by it. There's this where he sort of smart alecky toward, I guess he's tired of making a defense of how science can only explain how something works, but not why it works. And he's sort of touchy about that in his work. And he spends a lot of time sort of denouncing the legitimacy of why questions. And I know why he does that. And I even said the word why. I know the reason for that, because if he admits the genuine and truthful nature of why questions, right? That they exist and that they're important, right? The importance of those questions, then he's admitting that science can explain origin. And I know he doesn't want to do that, okay? Now, whether he'll ever admit that or not, I don't know that he'll ever do that, but others have observed, and rightfully so, that the scientific method is actually limited in what it can tell us. We'll probably discuss this on another occasion, but I would like to suggest tonight that we consider a couple of things that science cannot do. Number one, the scientific method can only evaluate what is available to the senses, right? So that would be touch, smell, hearing, taste, right? What we can see when you're dealing with the five senses. What we're dealing with in the scientific method are things that are observable to the senses. Right? I smell that smell. I hear that sound. I see that. I can taste that. I can feel that. We're dealing with what appeals to the senses in the scientific method. So hearing, smelling, seeing, touching, and tasting. Scientific method is limited to those areas. Okay, you can't go beyond that. Then, number two, the scientific method can only evaluate processes in the present, right? They have to be present tense processes. We're talking about current, ongoing cycles and happenings. It can't tell me what happened in the past. No scientific experiment can do that, right? Because it appeals to the senses. And if I can't see it, if I can't hear it, if I can't smell it, I can't taste it, I can't do those things, I have no ability to understand beyond the present when it comes to the scientific method. Now, accordingly, right, because it's limited to the present, the scientific method evaluates the operation of something, what I'm seeing, what I'm feeling, what I'm smelling, what I'm tasting, what I'm hearing, so on, in nature, meaning that it is limited to the nature of function. It can tell me how something works. It can tell me what's happening, right? So I can look at a scientific process, and if I'm a scientist, I can relay it to you in words, hopefully, that you understand, and I can say, here's what's going on. And I can probably look, as it's a repeatable process, and I can say, here's how that happens. Here's how blood flows to the heart and through the brain, and here's how the lungs operate. I know that because I've observed these repeatable processes, and I can tell you that's how these things work, which means that science, or the scientific method, can only yield conclusions on how something works from a repeatable event or a process. What it cannot explain is the why. It can't tell me the philosophical reasons behind anything, right? So I can look at a singular event in history and I can say, that's in the past. And because it's in the past, science can't evaluate that. It can't tell me anything about that in the past, like creation, right? So science has no capacity for explaining the beginning of the world. And Dawkins and others actually admit the limitations of science in their works. Now, when we claim that the universe that God exists and the universe bears the marks of its creator, that it has the fingerprints of God within creation, we're not suggesting that God can be empirically verified. We're not saying that. What we are suggesting is that the scientific method is not how we arrive at a conclusion for God's existence or his work in creation. And our proof, our evidence, is drawn from a separate but legitimate form of discovery that some people call origin science. Now, I'm a big fan of, if I'm going to watch a movie, it's got to be some sort of, it either has to be an action movie. You could put a war movie on TV, and I'm all for the war movies. And you can put Dirty Dozen on, and I'll cry in the Dirty Dozen, right? So I like war movies, but I also like movies that make you think. And that's why I think I really like crime movies, mystery movies and mystery novels and crime novels and things of that sort, because there's always some sort of exploration and there's always some sort of discovery being made. And that's why for a while, I don't watch a whole lot of TV, but when we had cable years ago, I think it's probably been 10, 11 years since we've had cable, I really was a big fan of CSI Miami, CSI, I think it was New York, and NCIS, because there was always a mystery and you had to solve the mystery of what happened by the evidence that was left behind. So origin science is actually not an appeal to discovery through the scientific method, but works like forensic science. That's how origin science works. It gathers evidence that is left behind after an action and assimilates all of the information that's available, all the evidence, and then it makes conclusions and deductions based upon the available evidence. So let's go back to that empty room scenario. Let's go back to that scenario. Now, my first impression is that the room is empty, right? So there's an empty room. It's empty. I can't conceive what's in it. I can't see into the room. I can't open the door, but I know the room is empty. I cannot apply the scientific method to try to explain things inside the room because they're not visible. I can't touch it, I can't taste it, I can't smell it, I can't hear it, I can't see it, I can't do those things. I can't apply the senses to what's in the room. But what if something or someone inside that room is causing an effect? What if somebody's doing that? And I need to figure out who that is or what that is based upon the effects. Then I can reason, right? That's a form of logic and a form of reason to be able to take the evidence that's there and reason backwards to a conclusion about the identity of that object or that something. And that's what we do when we are understanding the existence of God. So the claim by Dawkins and others of scientific superiority is not true when they're saying the scientific method can explain everything. It cannot do that. All right, so let's move to another reason that people choose to be atheists, and this has to do with morality and the conception of atheists of morality. They say that choosing morality based on God, Dawkins even comes close to calling it immoral. And he doesn't use that language, but he comes close. I think he implies that in his work on the God delusion. Because religion is viewed as a thief of autonomy, that it actually restricts moral activity because it robs us of choice that they claim that without God you would actually have, which is interesting because the Bible actually teaches moral autonomy, that we, not in the sense that we're free from restriction, but that you have choice. You actually have the choice. You have volition. You have choice. God gives it to you. And the very first story in the Bible in Genesis 2 and verse 3, or chapter 3 and chapter 2 of Genesis, is the story of people who rejected the love of God and did the wrong thing because God gave them the freedom to do that. But Dawkins, right, in his work is particularly adept at citing the reasons that theism fails to offer true morality. And I can't quote all of it, but he wrote a section in which he said most thoughtful people, and I love how they do that, right? Because it suggests if you don't think the same way, you're not really a thoughtful person. That's how we imply things in language. He goes, most thoughtful people would agree that morality in the absence of policing is somehow more truly moral than the kind of false morality that vanishes as soon as the police go on strike or the spy camera is switched off, whether the spy camera is a real one monitored in a police station or an imaginary one in heaven. Now, his argument is, if you base your morality on God, then the only reason that you act morally is because you fear God and you're trying to gain reward from God. And he said, that's false morality. All you're doing is doing something based on fear, but not because it's the right thing to do. And free from God is actually a better morality where you do it because it's the right thing to do. Now, he makes a number of terrible presumptions in that, and you probably heard some of those. In the class that we're actually going to do live for this, we're actually going to quote a lot more from Dawkins in this section, but that happens on page 230 of the book. If you've got the book and want to sort of read that section, I would start earlier and read probably 2 in the 220s and start up from there, and that whole chapter when he deals with that, and then get to about page 30 and beyond when he starts mocking religion for claiming that morality is based on, objectively based on God. he thinks that God is somehow like a police force, and he's just there to punish an evildoer, that he's not actually there for good purposes. And I think a lot of Dawkins' arguments based on a misconception of what God really is, of how he explains himself to be in Scripture. He claims through his statements that God's morality is arbitrary. It is not that at all. That it's without positive benefit to man. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more. But you can see in statements like that how he might have concluded that atheism's morality is a lot better because his conception of God is wrong. He doesn't understand the God of the Bible. So atheism is believed to provide true freedom to live as you want to live. Now, the Scriptures actually talk about this, and we did it last week. In Romans chapter 1, beginning in verse 18, we are given an illustration of people who did this very thing. And he talks about how that the righteousness of God was known by them. They knew God, but they did not glorify him as God, and they became people who worship the creation more than the Creator. And what happened was they had God as a part of their worldview. They understood him, Romans 1:20, by the things that were made, and they chose to X God out of the equation. They chose to take God out of the picture. And when you begin in verse 25 and following through verse 32 of that chapter, what it shows is what happens when people choose not to have God as the objective moral reference point in their worldview. They choose to live however they want to live, and essentially it's like the beasts of the earth. They just do whatever. There's no standard at all. And the claim that atheism says people will just do the right thing, that's not true. Without an objective point, a reference point of morality, people would just do whatever, and you end up with a world just like what was described at the end of chapter 1. I kept thinking of Judges 21:25. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and everybody did what was right in his own eyes. And I think that's pretty descriptive of what happens when you choose a morality that denies God as the objective reference point of the morality. And we're running out of time. I want to real quick talk about the last one. The last one is this claim of intellectual superiority, and that's why atheists choose atheism, because they think it's intellectually superior to do that. There has been a lot of grievance on atheists toward religion. There's no tolerance of it, and I understand, which interestingly is an objective claim, right? When you say I can't tolerate that, because you're saying there's something that is objectively right about atheism and something objectively wrong about religion. I agree, happen to believe in objective truth. All right, so I get that, but there has been a lot from the Freedom from Religion Foundation, and as this airs, it will air originally in around Christmas time. Well, you can see the ornaments in the back. We've already decorated early. We didn't do fall, so we just jumped straight to Christmas this year, where they are suing people who put nativity scenes at schools or out in front of a courthouse or any kind of Christmas-related something that might have any kind of religious connection at all. And they do this, and they intimidate on the basis mostly that religion is stupid and it's harmful for society. Now, atheists have worked their way into very prominent positions of politics, of government, universities, academia, things of that sort. So they have a lot of sway when it comes to how these organizations are going to react when it comes to things like this. But they mock religion as sort of being this ignorant position. And there was actually an attempt at a study to show that atheists actually have higher IQs than theists. And so they went through, this one guy went through in an issue of Psychology Today and suggested that the mean IQ of a non-religious person was around 103.09, and the mean IQ of a religious person was less than that at 97.14. Now, those results are questionable, and they're actually skewed because when you start with a false premise of what is and what's not religious and how worldviews work, you can't just sort of throw numbers out there on the basis of that, because of the people that you're interviewing who may not actually really be truly religious or may not really truly be theistic, and maybe they are just sort of fake religious people. So when you start with something that is already skewered and you try to base numbers on that, you don't get good numbers. I'm not the smartest tool in the shed, right? I wouldn't consider myself a genius by any means, but I have common sense. And there's this effort to frame religious people as stupid people. In fact, in Psalm 14 and verse 1, the Bible says, it's the fool that has said in his heart, there's no God. Or the fool is the one who denies the existence of God. Dawkins has done the same thing, and I would suggest if you read The God Delusion by Dawkins, or you read Sam Harris in his letter to a Christian nation, or you read Lewis Walpert in Six Impossible Things Before Breakfast, or Christopher Hitchens when he published God Is Not Great. All those target organized religion, the abuses of organized religion, but all of them come across with this sort of scathing Christianity stupid kind of tone in all of their works. And pride seems to be, and self-sufficiency seem to kind of steer atheist attacks. Dawkins himself said on page 3 of The God Delusion, he said, being an atheist is nothing to be apologetic about. On the contrary, it is something to be proud of, standing tall in the face of the far horizon, for atheism nearly always indicates a healthy independence and indeed a healthy mind. And his idea is atheism is the intellectually superior way. And they're scathing in their rebuke of religion. I am convinced that many people go the course of atheism because of the influences that they have academically or otherwise, where people in prominent positions who they admire and they see their visible success and they go that route. And sometimes we're presented with a scenario that people are only religious because we're raised to believe in God. And some may be, right? I get it that some may be, but that does not invalidate the existence of God. And so beginning next week, we're going to start delving into what the Bible teaches about faith, how evidence works. So I encourage you to get the notes and go through and look at that. We're going to study the word faith, belief, obedience, all those words in the Bible and what they have to do with evidence and how facts work to found that. And then we'll be dealing with things like design in the universe and how we look at cause and effect to understand the existence of God. But I hope you're benefiting from this study. It's a great study. It's pretty deep. There's a lot of material to cover each week, so I have to move pretty quickly. If you want to discuss anything, get with me, and I promise I'll sit down and discuss it with you. Again, I don't consider myself, I'm not a genius, but I have common sense. I think I can think through things and look at evidence honestly and come away with proper conclusions, and I know that you can too. We all can do that because God gave us the ability to do that. That's how He made us, in His image. All right. Hey, I'll see you next week at the same time. And until then, I want you to know that even if you don't believe in Him, God loves you, and I love you too. And I'll see you then. Thank you. Bye.